Good morning. It is great to be together today, and as we get started, this is the last week, where we will be addressing money, not forever, but for this series. And as we get started, I do want to just say, just to thank everyone. I know many of you perhaps know, some of you don't. My mom passed away this past Wednesday evening, late Wednesday evening. And very sweetly, after, we never made this real much public. She had Alzheimer's and had really just declined since my dad passed away in April. And so with all the grief, there was certainly just a sweetness and a sense of even just kind of a deep breath as she passed away very peacefully, and knowing that she is, her faith was deep and real, and her and my dad belong together. So we hold that, and it's just the response of the church that I get to participate in has been overwhelming, and I'm very grateful for the support. So I do want to say thank you, and I don't want to start on such a heavy note, but I just want to express my gratitude and what it means to be a part of this place for me and my family. So hard turn, right? I told y'all at the beginning of this series that this was not a ploy to ask for money, right? That's we just ask you to kind of, hey, can we trust each other? This is not a ploy to ask for money, but the giving is a part of how we think about our money. And so I'm going to talk about that today, but in a way it's probably different than you're used to hearing. So I hope that you will take what I'm saying to heart and be willing to maybe perhaps experiment and do some things in your own life in ways that I think will profoundly affect your relationship with money, which is what we've been talking about. And what we've learned, if anything, is that your relationship with money it's complicated. There are no easy, fast answers. And part of where my mind has been able to expand in this is to think about, and we looked at this last week a little bit more detail, that there's a value that God has for the way people, his people particularly, interact with one another around the idea of our possessions and the way we care for one another, particularly in a fallen world. And so it's trying to get a vision for the values of God's economy and not just mind biblical principles that we can apply to our own finances, right? So I know we can do that, but that's not what I'm trying to do in this series. I want for our imaginations to be awakened. I want us to see things a little bit differently. And so I've introduced a couple of terms to you. One of them was generativity or generative, to be generative, that our generosity becomes something more. I've had lots of conversation on this. People have been emailing me, talking to me about, what do you mean by generative? And here's what I'm thinking, and here's this, and here's that. But it's a new idea to me. And the reason this is important for us to sort of hold on to, because our default, the culture we live in, our default thinking about money is always about a return on investment. And what we mean is, if I give $10, am I going to get $12 back? Right? If I give this much money, am I going to get this much money back? It's almost always scaled in how much return we get, how much monetary return we get on the monetary investment we made. And that's just the default. It's almost everything that you see on the news. It's almost every article you read. It's almost anything whenever you're doing a pitch for an investment. I've tried this. Because I've talked to a lot of people about helping with some things we've got some ideas about. And they're like, what's the return on investment? I'm like, well, you're going to bring a lot of dignity to a lot of people. Well, not so, and so we have this default. So we just have to find a way to think differently about this. Because whatever is created, right, or whatever happens is almost always secondary to whatever money we will earn back on our investment. And I just want to be able to flip that around and say, let's at least consider something more. And so generative, here's the definition. Generative is the capacity for our generosity to create something beyond what is given, I've been stumbling on this for a while, trying to understand it. And it was just a great example with our college students. They had a conference a couple weeks ago, or 2 weekends ago. Lots of college students were here. Teaching and worship and all the things you would expect. But one of the things I thought was just so profound, Carson and his team, for their dinner break or their lunch break, one of the meal breaks, they gave vouchers to the students to go to local minority-owned restaurants. And what they had already done is they had already gone to these restaurants and kind of goes, hey, we're going to be sending a bunch of kids here to do blah, 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 blah. They all, and they were like, oh, we're so glad to do this. And so all the students went, or a lot of the students went to the restaurants, used their vouchers. But what the response back from the owners, from the business owners, these are all local, all minority owned, was like, this was such a great exercise. A lot of them actually did things for the students that were a little bit beyond what just they had paid for. The return back from the way we partner with these restaurants, what they were doing, it just kind of created something more, like something relational, something beautiful. It's generative. It wasn't just an exchange of money for goods or services, but it produced or created something else that has tremendous value, and how we learn to relate to one another, how we learn to interact in our community and in our world. And it's just being really strategic, really creative, really aware of all the different ways in which we can do that for one another, whether maybe it's supporting various businesses. You know, it's so funny, the church is notorious for like trying to boycott businesses that they don't agree with, right? Which is... But never mind. But to be able to like strategically offer ourselves in ways that are helpful and encouraging, even to people who may not even believe like us. Like there's all kinds of things we can do to become generative. And it's just gonna take a level of shrewdness. It's gonna take a level of vision. It's gonna take a level of sensitivity and discernment. All these things are available to us. A lot of people have been asking me about this idea, you know, is it wrong to do this or wrong to do that, right? Should I take this job? And let me, you know, here's the thing. You know, profits are not wrong. Interest is not wrong. Equity is not wrong. This is not about right or wrong. A lot of what Jesus is driving at in the passages and throughout the scriptures isn't about trying to say these things are wrong, you shouldn't do them. He's dealing with a whole different problem. He's helping us address and deal with a whole different problem. He does not value poverty, and he does not condemn having wealth. Like none of those things happen in the scriptures and through the teachings of the scriptures or through the teachings of Jesus. And part of what I want for us to understand is the reason we have to keep reminding ourselves is that we will almost always default back to what we've always known. I'm trying just again to help us or to get us to see. And so people have asked me questions like this. Mike, should I take a job because it pays more money? Is that wrong to do? Well, of course it's not wrong to do. Everybody probably here has taken a job in order to get paid money. Like it wasn't like your calling on life, like, right? I mean, if you do that, you're gonna be broke, but you're gonna be really stuck because you're gonna have to get a job in order to find the job more than likely. And so you're sitting around waiting and say, I remember like I worked at Chick-fil-A, I worked at McDonald's for 1 hour. When I was 16 years old. That's a whole other story. I worked at Little Giant, which is a grocery distribution, like a grocery food farmer's market kind of thing, where I had to load boxes of fruit and vegetables. I was like 5'3", weighed like 95 pounds. It was not a great fit. But they let me have my mullet, so I worked there, right? They didn't make me cut my hair. I did landscaping for a while, and that is very hard work. It's actually very skilled. I was terrible at it. I have so much respect for people who can do all this stuff because I'm like, I'm not any good at this. And I learned, but oftentimes they would say, Mike, will you do this? I say, yes, I'll do this. How much are you going to pay me? And it was just an exchange. Right? There's nothing wrong with that because you need to have access to money to make it in this world, to pay for whatever it is, to pay your way. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. Here's what's wrong. If you are doing something to make money or more money so that you do not have to trust, that's where it becomes problematic. What Jesus was always, and we all know the power of this. We all know the power of this, right? I joke about this all the time, but this is why you have a lottery list. This is why if you won the lottery, you would do these things because then you wouldn't have to trust anybody ever again. Like that's what Jesus is warring against in almost all of his teachings. We're going to look in Luke chapter 12, and Luke seems to be sort of chock full of these parables of, the rich man and the money manager we looked at last week, of these little teachings of Zacchaeus and all these other things that all have to do with finances and money and the exchange of this. In Luke chapter, we looked last week in Luke chapter 16, there was this central teaching that was really powerful. I just want to read it again, Luke chapter 16, verse 10, then we'll flip back to Luke 12. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much or with much. And whoever is dishonest with little will be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? Right? Jesus is just anchoring this to how do we learn to have faith? How do we learn to be faithful with what it is we've been entrusted to? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? And then he adds this line that a lot of us have heard: no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So this is this context. And what a lot of us here, especially in our entrepreneurial, capitalistic, go-get-em, assertive thing, is here's what the principle. If you are faithful with a little, guess what you will get? Much. So what do? I'm gonna be faithful with a little and then rain down the stuff. The point of being faithful with a little is being faithful, period. It is not a means to an end. This is not the promise of God that if you do this, he'll give you that. He's teaching us, can we learn to be faithful? And the whole thing is about our allegiance. Clay and I were talking about this because I've drawn these two ideas, this kingdom that is governed by love, and I always draw fear on the other side. But it's interesting because what Jesus says is you'll love one or hate the other. So he connects this to love, but perhaps it's a lesser love or a misplaced love or a love that can't source us the way we're called to. Because he makes it very clear that to love money is a possibility. This was the command, right? Do you not know that the love of money is the root of all evil? That somehow our affections are driven to this. This is what actually produces in us or manifests itself in this sort of governance of fear, where now we're reacting and doing that. We talked about this. And over here, the economy that we're called to live in, that God establishes, is an economy of trust. These are two very different things. Over here, what ends up happening is when you are governed by fear because you love money, or this is where your allegiance, or this is your source, or this is what you depend on more than anything else. This is how you know how to make your will be done. You will almost always spend most of your time sort of chronically calculating and in some ways manipulating how things are going to turn out. And you're always going to be doing sort of a cost analysis on what's the return on investment. You're going to sort of lose. I think it's in this place that we most often lose the ability to discern, because we're using a fundamentally different scale to try and operate with what we've been entrusted to. The point is for us to learn how to be faithful with what has been entrusted to us. And then this becomes, no one intends to be greedy, but this is just fertile soil for greed to occur. And all of us at some level have probably struggled with a tendency towards greed, whether we like to acknowledge it or not. But this is why, because it gets rooted in this sense. And we all, if you've ever tasted anything about having money and the power and the things that go, the options and the choices that go along with it, you see how easy it is to one, as soon as you taste that, to never want to let it go. And as soon as you get that place, to start to calculate and figure out how is this going to work and how am I going to hold and what's going to happen here. And then before you know it, you're just sort of sucked into withholding and over, you get the idea. So there's another side, another way that we're called to live. And this really, to me, part of the reason the second term I've introduced is this idea of financial congruence. One is because it disrupts our thinking of financial peace or financial freedom. It's sort of, we don't have to worry anymore because we have what we need. It's financial congruence. It's that as money comes your way, whether it's a little or whether it's a lot, as money comes your way, what it needs to do is it needs to agree, or it needs to fall into place. It needs to integrate into your life with God. And the mission and the vision and the call he has on earth, it needs to integrate into that. It needs to come in. Part of what we talk about around here is that financial stewardship is really an acknowledgement that everything that we receive belongs to God and we are mere stewards of it. We're not owners or possessors. It comes through us, through our hands. And we get to participate in that way. And it's always built on trust. It's always built on trust. When we learn how to trust God and trust that he has provided and does provide, this is the fertile soil for generosity. And it is in our generosity that's sort of linked with faith that begins to build sort of a culture of generativity, or a culture that is generative. And you're gonna have to noodle on this. We're gonna talk about this for years to come, but that's what I mean. It is not just a mindset of how to apply biblical principles to our finances. It's a heart set about how are we going to live in this world with one another. Last week we looked that there was a lot of emphasis on creating systems that provide for people who aren't able to provide for themselves. And there's a lot of I know it's a complicated issue. That's why we titled this, It's Complicated. And to be generative, right, might mean giving money to things, but it also might mean showing up. And if people ask me with our partners, Mike, we give to the church, are there ways in which we can be generative? Yes. Volunteer at some of our partners, right? Go to Rise Up Farms, go down to Vigilant Hope, like volunteer them, because what you're doing is you're saying, we've given money to this, and now we're gonna show up and we're gonna build sort of relational equity in these places as well. And we're gonna create something more than just giving our money. That part's not actually complicated, right? That's what it does. Something starts to happen. We have to learn to create relational ways for us to consider, right, others, for us to consider the kind of economy that we want to live within and the kind of economy we would like to create. That's available to us. These are kind of radical ideas, but I really believe this is available to a group of people who are willing to do some things and consider some things differently. We might actually be able to create something different and hopeful and dignifying. But it's going to take a lot of work on our parts. And here's the definition of financial congruence. Financial congruence is stewarding our money in a way that allows us to contribute to and to create the kinds of things that honor God, reflect his image, and demonstrate his love. To recognize that we can enter into restaurants or places that we might not likely go because we always go to Chick-fil-A, we always do whatever it is we do. We deviate or we change our habits to deliberately do things, to build relationships, to understand some things. We create opportunities we haven't considered before. We demonstrate, we are able to do all sorts of things that allow us to enter into places and to bring something to bear. And I want for you to consider, like when you're stewarding your money, it's not just paying your bills and giving money to your church. Wink, wink, I'm just kidding. But you're like, how can you create the kinds of things? Because building businesses and giving people opportunity to work and have jobs and earn. These are important things. I talk to a lot of my business friends and they'll say, Mike, I don't feel like what I'm doing is fast. When you give someone the opportunity to work with their hands or their minds, you bring a level of dignity and value, communicate something to them. I know we've kind of lost this in our entitlement culture, but to work at Chick-fil-A gave me dignity and worth. I contributed and participated in things. And we have to have a mindset for that with one another. It starts with you and me, how we see this. But it's to learn to be generative, to make sure that what we are doing with all of our money that comes into our sort of responsibility, that we say, Lord, can we make this congruent? Can this agree with the kind of life that you are calling me to live? And that's a hard question. It's a hard question. What kind of life are you calling me to live? We learn to live in a trust economy, which is so foreign to the way in which we normally live in almost every financial exchange that we have. So this is a tall order for us to get to. But what is the activity of a trust economy? You know what it is? It's faith. It's faith. We have to learn, this is exactly what Jesus is driving at, right? To be faithful. To be faithful doesn't mean that you buried it in the ground, right? There's parables about that. To be faithful means you said, Lord, what would you have me do with this? Do you want me to save it? You want me to spend it? Do you want me to give it? What would you have me do? Lord, this belongs to you. How might I? And there are times when God actually allows us and gives us things for our own enjoyment. There's nothing wrong with this. This isn't a guilt trip. This is about calling us to learn how to discern and to be faithful to what we've been entrusted with. It's interesting, we live in a very affluent society. And a lot of people I talk to who have a lot often feel guilty about what they have. And I, in some way, understand it, but at some point it's like, look, it's a big responsibility you've been entrusted with. And we just have to, Lord, can you help us to see? And can you help us how to be great stewards? And you cannot do this alone. Like, you can't do it alone. Because here's what's going to happen if you do it alone. You're going to use whatever category of income that you're in, and you're going to do what everybody else in your category of income does. And that may or may not be helpful. And so you need people around you. You need to be willing to have these conversations with people that you trust. I don't think this is just a free for all. Don't go on social media and say, hey, what do you think I should do with this $250,000, right? You need to have some people that you trust to enter into these places with you. But one thing for sure, and this is Luke chapter 12. Jesus tells a story. He calls it, the modern versions call it the parable of the rich fool. And this guy basically comes and says, Lord, will you tell my brother to divide my inheritance with me? And Jesus is like, well, who made me judge over you guys? And then he gives him this warning, watch out and be on guard from all kinds of greed, for life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. Then he tells a story. There was a guy, he was a rich man, and he had a bunch of grain, and he built a barn to house his grain, and then he says, oh my gosh, I've got so much grain, whatever shall I do? I know I'll build bigger barns to house all the grain that I've stored. Got all this stuff, and I just need to build bigger stuff to store all the stuff that I've got. That's kind of the picture, right? You get this. And then God says to him, and he says, I will say to myself, self, I have plenty of grain, so I'll just store up all this, and I'll eat, drink, and be merry. And then God comes and he says, you fool, this very night, your life will be demanded on you, and what will you get from what you have prepared for yourself? And then he tells this next story. Do not worry about your clothes, or do not worry about your food, or do not worry about your house, or do not worry about all these things. This is like Matthew 6. Sounds just like Matthew 6, but this is in Luke chapter 12. And then he says this, starting in verse 29. And listen to the words, do not set your heart on what you'll eat or drink. Right, we read this too fast. We go, I'm not supposed to worry about what I eat or what I drink. No. He says, he's talking about something deeper. It's a heart set. Don't set your heart on these things. Do not worry about these things. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father in heaven knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. It's a call for us to rearrange. This isn't about going to heaven when you die. It's about on earth as it is in heaven. Right? We've got to get out of that mindset that to seek first the kingdom of God means we got to long to be in heaven on streets of gold singing Amazing Grace for 10,000 years. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about seek first what is happening in the world in which you live, and how can you bring all of God's longing and his intention into these moments. And how can you use what you have to do that? Seek his kingdom. And then everything else, right, is going to work in the way that it ought to. Verse 32, and then he adds this, do not be afraid. And he says, little flock. I love this. I looked at that's what it says. He just, do not be afraid, little flock. Like he's just pulling them together. Hey, it's going to be okay, like a group hug kind of thing. Don't be afraid. He's telling us, man, your tendency to this is going to pull you so hard. Do not be afraid, for the Father is pleased to give you the kingdom. It's just his heart. And here comes the fun part. What does he say next? We're not saying that out loud. Sell your possessions and give it to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. And you just go, poof, poof. It's so funny. I have a lot of people who take the Bible so literally, but not this one, right? They're like, wait, no, Jesus was using a metaphor here, man, for sure. But you have to wrestle with that, right? This is what Jesus said. Like, what should you do? Because should you just, I've had honest conversations with people who said, should I just sell everything I have and like just give it to like 3 or 4 charities? And you know, I've wrestled with this for a long time. I do not think that's what Jesus is advocating. We do have a very different economic system that we live in. In fact, to be honest, if a lot of people sold all they had, they would still have debt. They would still owe people, right? Or some of what you do possess, like you use the money off of those things to do other things. So it's complicated. Would we agree? I can't just sell all my stuff. People don't want some of my stuff, right? So like, what do you do? And what it seems to be, because there was a much more barter idea, like you couldn't just get your cash out very easily. So there was a way to do this. It was about leverage. It was about learning how to live in, and mostly I think it would call for us to detach ourselves from our possessions. These things do not and cannot define us, and that we're no longer calculating out of fear of holding on to them, but we're going to learn how to entrust everything that we have to him. This is a very hard order, tall thing to do. I can tell you stories about when I bought my house a few years ago, 10, 12 years ago, all the things that have happened over to try to say, Lord, is this what you would have for me? Do I need to live here, or do I need to live here? Do I need to do this, or do I need to do that? And there is no verse that I found that says I should do this. The verses that I found were things like, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. I'm like, I got a family, should I do that? It's complicated. And you're going to make decisions about where you live and how you spend your money. And guess how you're going to make those decisions? You're going to make them by faith. Lord, could I receive this from you? Could I live in this place and receive this from you? And it's just a simple way to align yourself so that your heart doesn't get set in the opposite direction. We're learning financial congruence. We're learning generativity. One of the things that we possess are often useful for what God wants to do through our lives for other people. And this is always a part of this. The goal isn't poverty, but it's love. Right? It's really interesting that Jesus is telling this story to people who have means. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to sell their possessions and give to the poor. He said, you guys have something, so let's figure out how to use this in a little bit different way. And then the final warning is this: for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. You can have possessions and not be driven by them or defined by them, right? You know people like this. You can have possessions and it's everything to somebody, like they are defined by it. We know people like that. You can have very little and not be driven by the desire to have what you don't have. Or you can have very little and be just entitled and mad and resentful and taking advantage. I mean, it's not a matter of one or the other. It's about what's happening in our hearts. Could be faithful to him. And it's interesting. This is one of the big 10. Thou shalt not covet. Right? It's the idea that we would harm another person because we want what they have. We would see them as competition for some slice of the pie that we think we should have for ourselves. I mean, this is in the big 10. Jesus used this in Matthew 13 as one of the soils that was most dangerous, right? He says it's the thorny soil that we are led away and we are distracted and consumed by the riches of this world. He doesn't indict him. He says you just have to be extremely careful. Right? It's harder for a rich person to get into the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through an eye of a needle. And the disciples are like, who can be saved? And Jesus says, it's impossible with man, but not with God. You know what he's inviting you to do? To trust him. To trust him. Faith is the activity in a trust economy. It is. And by that means that everything that you are doing it believing or trusting or hoping in something. You buy a Chick-fil-A sandwich, like, hope this is going to fill my belly, right? You're trusting that. Everything so what we're learning is how do we connect this into something more? Into something more. How do we steward what we have for something that God longs for? And again, I want to be really careful. He cares for you and for me. It is not wrong or bad to receive goodness from God in these ways. I don't want to go prosperity on us, but I also don't want you to feel bad. We're going to have to learn this together. And guilt is going to be zero help in learning it. So I don't want you to feel guilty, not on my watch, right? I don't want that. But faith is trust. This is how we define this. It's trust that takes a step. Faith that's just talked about in theory is not faith. It actually has to make its way as an activity in your actual lived life. Does anyone want to guess how you exercise faith with your money? You give it away. You give it away. So here's what I tell you. I've done this a long time. People come to me and they'll ask me about tithing. Mike, do you believe that 10% should go to the church? Is that biblical? And in my heart of hearts, I'm like, I really want to tell them, yes, it is. You should give 10% right here to Port City Church. But I don't believe that's what Jesus is instructing us to do. I give 10% here for a lot of reasons. But what you do need to do is to give something. Every person who wants to learn how to have a hopeful relationship with their money, regardless of what you believe about God, like in any capacity, if you want to avoid this, you need to learn how to give. You need to give something. To give something. What most people do is they go, I can't give 10% or I can't give this, so they try to make up for it. Or you try to go, well, when I get to where I can afford to give 10%, then I'll give. And that is a terrible idea. Because you will probably never get there. You give something. I've told people this. I would rather you give $5 a month than $500 at one time trying to make up or prove or demonstrate that you're serious. Do you know why? Because you need to give something. You need to start somewhere. And number two, you need to give regularly. Do you know why? Because you were telling your heart, where you were reminding yourself on a daily, on a weekly, or a monthly, on a regular basis. And just so you know, the math of $500 versus $5 a month is different. But what I would be more concerned about is the regularity of you offering and reminding and giving. That's the whole point. You learn how to do it with small things, guess what's likely to happen? If you are a high school or college student and you have a new job or a job where you're making just a little bit of money, I do this with my kids, I would start 100% from the get-go. Because what you think is when you have enough money to afford to give, you'll give, and you won't. If you are faithful with little things, right, then you're going to be able to be faithful as those numbers get bigger. And it's just to start somewhere. And I am dead serious. I do not care about, how much you decide to give out of it. I do care where you give it. I can assure you this, if you give money to Port City Community Church, it is stewarded, and I've dealt with a lot of organizations around the country. It is stewarded as well as any organization that I have ever seen. The procedures and protocols and policies we have in place they're exceptionally seen and transparent, all those things. So you should feel very confident. We also have lots of partners that you are welcome to give to. Like my goal for you is to say, Lord, I want to begin to tell my heart where to go. I want to be faithful with my money so I can develop a sort of an idea of generativity and financial congruence in my life. But you give something and you give regularly. In fact, what we're doing is we're actually starting a response fund through the church, and everything that's given, you can see it, it's on the website. Everything that is given to the response fund will go directly to our partners at Convoy of Hope, who are on the ground in the Middle East providing humanitarian relief in both Israel and in Gaza. It is absolutely astounding. And so every dime that you give to that doesn't go through here, it goes directly to them. So that's available to you. There are lots of other ways. You can see all the list of our partners on the website, and I would just encourage you to give something and to do it regularly. You know, no matter how little you think that it is, and you're going to try to talk yourself with them, it's so little it doesn't matter. What I'm telling you is it will matter to you. It will matter to you. It will matter to God, and it will matter to his work in your life. God can feed 5,000 people with a couple of fish and some loaves of bread. He can build a church with a few college students and absolutely no money. It is not a problem for him to do stuff with our little. It's just not. The question is, are we going to allow him to do that or not? That's what I would encourage you to do. This is what begins to build our relationship with our money. The second thing we want to make available to you is we are going to be starting, this will be in January and February in the new year, a pilot group for financial stewardship called Gods. It's a reminder, we're going to learn how to live as stewards of what God has entrusted us to. We're going to learn financial stewardship as a spiritual discipline. It is a 4-week study. If you are here and you're in our church and you need help, right? You can't figure out, like, your money's going out faster than it's coming in, you can't get in a place where you can give. We get all that. That's normal. We want to be able to help you. This is some very practical advice that you will, or not just advice, it's practical help on budgeting and spending and all the things. But here's what you will need to do. And we're going to wait till January for a reason. You will need to track every penny that you spend for the entire month of January, and you show up on February at the first class with your whole months of expenses, right? And the reason is because we'll know where we're starting from. This is actually good because you won't have to fight with your spouse, because all you're doing is tracking what you're spending. It's just, you just put your receipts in a box or a bucket, you track what you spend, you show up, and then we're going to use all that to sort of help you find out where you are and what can be done. So if you need help, right, the website is this, it's portcity.church/interest. If you are here and you happen to be, you like spreadsheets, God help you, right? I'm just kidding, you're good with that kind of stuff and you want to be helpful, we would love, I've already had a lot of people ask me about this. Hey, are there people we can help? Yes, there are lots of people that both can help and need help. That's why we want to be a church, right? And that's how we are a church. So I want you to be able to use that same interest form, and you can just mark on there, hey, here's where I think I could be helpful. We will be in touch with you. We're going to be doing some training in the month of January. Then it will start in February. So here's the good news. It might take some time, but November's not a good time to try to manage your budget, and December is a terrible time to try to manage your budget. So we're going to just, when everybody's making their New Year's resolutions and picking their words to not go in debt and do all things, we're just going to leverage that and we're going to help. Can we do that? Doesn't that sound hopeful? Do you know why this is so important? Because it's complicated, right? It's complicated. And we have to get ourselves in a position, right, to be faithful stewards so we can be responsive to whatever it is that God wants to do in us and through us, and so that we steward our money. We steward our money in such a way that we contribute to and create the kind of things that honor God, that reflect his image, and that demonstrate his love. And if we do that well, I believe the results of that will not just be generous, but generative. And this is what we have to learn how to do, right? Jesus, thank you for the challenges that you have given us as your followers. Father, I ask you to give us wisdom, you would give us shrewdness, you would give us faith, you would give us creativity. God, that the ideas and the ways in which we can both have experienced congruence in the ways in which we can be generative, would just begin to, the floodgates would open in that. We would find ways we can support one another, those who are struggling to make ends meet and those who have more than they did. Somehow you would just allow us to work together in the kind of economy that would value and honor what you intend. And God, we don't fully know how to do that, but we believe that you do, and we fully believe that you can lead us into those places for the sake of what you long for here on earth, just as it is in heaven. It's your pleasure to give us the kingdom. So Lord, will we have the faith to walk in it? And I lift all this to the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.